The wind howled like a wounded beast, tearing through the icy wasteland with a fury that could freeze a man's soul. The explorer trudged forward, his heavy boots crunching against the snow. He was alone, as he had been for months, searching for something, anything, that could explain the strange signals his equipment had picked up. Then he saw it. A massive structure, half buried in the ice, glinted under the pale sunlight. It was ancient, its surface covered in symbols he couldn't understand. His heart raced as he approached, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. He pulled out his tools and began chipping away at the ice, his hands numb but his determination unshaken. Hours later, he broke through. Inside, the air was still, almost unnaturally so. The walls were smooth, glowing faintly with a blue light. And there, in the center of the room, was a sight that made his breath catch. A woman, frozen in a block of ice. She was beautiful, her features perfectly preserved, as if she had been frozen just moments ago. Her long hair floated around her like a halo, and her face was calm, almost peaceful. The explorer reached out, his gloved hand trembling as he touched the ice. The moment his fingers made contact, the ice began to crack. He stepped back, his heart pounding as the crack spread, faster and faster, until the ice shattered. The woman's eyes flickered open, and she gasped, her breath visible in the cold air. She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Before he could answer, the ground beneath them shook. The walls of the structure groaned, and chunks of ice began to fall from the ceiling. The explorer grabbed her hand, pulling her to her feet. "We need to go. Now." They ran, the structure collapsing behind them. The woman stumbled, still weak from her long slumber, but the explorer held her steady. As they burst into the open air, the structure collapsed with a deafening roar, sending a cloud of snow and ice into the sky. The explorer turned to the woman, his chest heaving. "Are you okay?" She nodded, but her eyes were distant, as if she were remembering something far away. "Thank you," she said softly. "But this is only the beginning." The explorer didn't know what she meant, but he could feel it, a sense of something bigger, something dangerous. And yet, as he looked into her eyes, he knew one thing for certain, his life would never be the same. The woman stood shivering in the freezing wind, her thin, ancient clothing offering little protection against the cold. The explorer quickly removed his heavy coat and draped it over her shoulders. She looked at him with gratitude, her eyes still filled with confusion and wonder. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though her legs wobbled as she took a step. The explorer supported her, his arm around her shoulders as they moved away from the crumbling ruins. The snowstorm was picking up, and visibility was dropping fast. He knew they had to find shelter soon, or they wouldn't survive the night. As they trudged through the snow, the woman began to speak, her voice soft and melodic, though her words were in a language he didn't understand. She paused, realizing he couldn't comprehend her, and instead pointed to herself. "Lyra," she said slowly, tapping her chest. "Lyra," the explorer repeated, nodding. He pointed to himself. "John." She smiled faintly, the first sign of warmth in her otherwise bewildered expression. "John," she echoed, her voice carrying a strange, almost musical quality. They continued their journey, the storm raging around them. John kept glancing back at the ruins, now barely visible in the distance. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The wind seemed to carry whispers, faint and eerie, but he told himself it was just his imagination. After what felt like hours, they finally reached a small cave John had used as a shelter before. He helped Lyra inside, then quickly gathered some dry wood he had stored there. Within minutes, a small fire was crackling, casting flickering shadows on the cave walls. Lyra sat close to the fire, her hands outstretched to the warmth. She stared into the flames, her expression distant. John watched her, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? How had she survived in that ice for so long? And why did he feel such a strong connection to her, as if they had known each other for years? Lyra, he said gently, trying to get her attention. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. Do you remember anything? How you ended up in that place? She frowned, struggling to find the words. I remember darkness. Cold. A voice, telling me to wait. Wait for you. John's eyes widened. Wait for me? How could you have been waiting for me? I didn't even know that place existed until a few days ago. Lyra shook her head, frustrated. I don't know. It's fuzzy. But I know you are important. You saved me. John didn't know what to say. He had always been a man of science, someone who relied on facts and evidence. But this was beyond anything he had ever encountered. He decided to focus on the immediate problem, survival. We'll figure it out, he said, trying to sound reassuring. But first, we need to get out of this storm. My research base isn't far from here. We can rest there, and you can recover. Lyra nodded, though her eyes still held a hint of fear. Thank you, John. I trust you. Her words struck a chord deep within him. He had spent most of his life alone, focused on his work, never allowing himself to get close to anyone. But now, in this frozen wilderness, he felt a bond forming with this mysterious woman, a bond he couldn't explain. As the fire burned low, John noticed something strange. Lyra's skin seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, and the cuts and bruises she had sustained during their escape were healing before his eyes. He blinked, wondering if he was imagining it, but the evidence was undeniable. Lyra, he said slowly, how are you doing that? She looked down at her hands, as if noticing the changes for the first time. I don't know. It's always been this way. My people, we were different. John's mind raced. If she wasn't entirely human, what did that mean? And what other abilities might she have? Before he could ask more, a loud noise echoed outside the cave, a deep, guttural growl that sent chills down his spine. Lyra's eyes widened in fear. They're here. Who's here? John asked, his voice tense. The ones who put me in the ice. They don't want me free. John grabbed his rifle, his heart pounding. Stay behind me. The growling grew louder, accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps crunching in the snow. John peered out of the cave, his finger on the trigger. In the darkness, he could see shapes moving, large, shadowy figures that didn't look human. We need to go, he whispered, turning back to Lyra. Now. She nodded, her fear replaced by determination. Together, they slipped out of the cave and into the storm, the creatures close behind. John didn't know what they were up against, but one thing was clear, Lyra's awakening had set something in motion, something dangerous. And he was right in the middle of it. The storm raged on, the wind howling like a wild beast as John and Lyra stumbled through the snow. The shadowy figures were close behind, their growls echoing through the night. John's heart pounded in his chest, his grip tightening on his rifle. He had no idea what they were up against, but he knew they couldn't stop, not if they wanted to survive. This way. John shouted over the wind, pulling Lyra toward a narrow path between two icy cliffs. The path was treacherous, slick with ice and snow, but it was their only chance to lose their pursuers. Lyra followed without hesitation, her movement surprisingly agile despite her weakened state. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes wide with fear. They're getting closer. John didn't need to look back to know she was right. The growls were louder now, more urgent. He pushed forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The research base wasn't far, but in this storm, it might as well have been miles away. As they rounded a bend in the path, Lyra suddenly stopped, her hand gripping John's arm. "Wait," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "What is it?" John asked, his voice tense. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if listening to something only she could hear. Then she pointed to the left. "There. A cave. We can hide." John hesitated. He hadn't noticed any caves in this area before, but he trusted her instincts. They scrambled toward the spot she had indicated, and sure enough, there was a small opening in the cliffside, partially hidden by a snowdrift. They slipped inside, the cave just large enough for the two of them. John crouched near the entrance, his rifle ready, while Lyra pressed herself against the wall, her breathing shallow. The growls grew louder, and John could see the shadowy figures now, tall, hulking creatures with glowing eyes and jagged claws. They moved with unnatural speed, their forms blending into the storm. John held his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger. But the creatures didn't stop. They passed the cave without even glancing inside, their growls fading into the distance. John let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging with relief. "How did you know about this cave?" he asked, turning to Lyra. She shook her head, her expression troubled. "I don't know. It's like I could feel it. Like the land speaks to me." John stared at her, his mind racing. Her abilities were beyond anything he had ever seen, and they seemed to be growing stronger. But now wasn't the time to dwell on it. "We need to keep moving," he said, helping her to her feet. "The base isn't far, but we have to be careful. Those things could come back." Lyra nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I'll follow you." They left the cave and continued their journey, the storm finally beginning to ease. The snow fell more gently now, and the wind died down to a whisper. John kept his rifle at the ready, his eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of danger. As they walked, Lyra began to open up. "My people, we lived in harmony with the land," she said, her voice soft but steady. "We could feel its energy, its life. But there were others, those who wanted to take that power for themselves. They trapped me in the ice to keep me from stopping them." John listened intently, his curiosity growing with every word. "Who were they? What did they want?" Lyra hesitated, as if the memories were painful. "They called themselves the Void Walkers. They sought to drain the life from the land, to use its energy for their own gain. My people fought them, but we were outnumbered. In the end, I was the only one left." Her voice broke, and John could see the pain in her eyes. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," he said firmly. "We'll figure this out together." Lyra looked at him, a faint smile touching her lips. "Thank you, John. I don't know what I would have done without you." They walked in silence for a while, the weight of her words hanging in the air. John couldn't shake the feeling that they were part of something much bigger than themselves, a battle that had been raging for centuries, long before he was born. Finally, they reached the research base, a small but sturdy structure built into the side of a mountain. John quickly unlocked the door and ushered Lyra inside, the warmth of the interior a welcome relief after the freezing cold. "We'll be safe here," he said, locking the door behind them. "At least for now." Lyra looked around, her eyes wide with curiosity. The base was filled with equipment, computers, maps, and tools for studying the environment. It was a stark contrast to the ancient ruins where she had been found. John gestured to a chair. "Sit down. I'll get you something to eat and drink. You must be exhausted." Lyra nodded, sinking into the chair with a sigh. As John busied himself in the small kitchen, she closed her eyes, her mind drifting back to the past. She could still hear the voices of her people, their laughter and songs echoing in her memory. But there was something else too, a faint, insistent whisper, like a warning. John, she said suddenly, her eyes snapping open. He turned, a plate of food in his hands. What is it? They're coming, she said, her voice trembling. The Void Walkers. They know where we are. John set the plate down, his expression grim. How much time do we have? Lyra shook her head. Not much. They're close. John grabbed his rifle, his mind racing. The base was secure, but it wasn't designed to withstand an attack. They needed a plan, and fast. We'll hold them off as long as we can, he said, his voice steady. But if things get too dangerous, we'll have to run. Lyra stood, her eyes filled with determination. I won't let them take me again. And I won't let them hurt you. John nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Together, then. As they prepared for the inevitable confrontation, John couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm. Despite the danger, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. And he was ready to fight. The research base was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the generator in the corner. John stood by the window, his rifle resting against his shoulder as he scanned the snowy landscape outside. The storm had completely passed, leaving behind a clear, moonlit night. But the calm only made him more uneasy. Lyra sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. She stared into the liquid, her mind far away. The memories were coming back to her in fragments, flashes of her past, her people, and the terrible battle that had led to her imprisonment. John, she said softly, breaking the silence. He turned to her, his expression softening. What is it? I remember more now, she said, her voice trembling. The Void Walkers, they weren't always evil. They were once like us, connected to the land. But something changed them. They became greedy, desperate for power. They started draining the life from the earth, and when my people tried to stop them, they destroyed everything. John walked over and sat across from her, his eyes filled with concern. How did you survive? Lyra took a deep breath, her hands tightening around the mug. I was chosen. My people believed I had a special connection to the land, a power that could one day restore balance. They put me in the ice to protect me, to keep me safe until the time was right. But I never thought it would take this long. John leaned forward, his voice gentle. And now that you're awake, what happens next? Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. I have to stop them. The Void Walkers are still out there, and if they find me, they'll try to use my power for their own gain. I can't let that happen. John nodded, his mind racing. He had always been a man of action, someone who believed in facing problems head-on. But this was different. This was a battle that had been raging for centuries, and he was just one man. We'll figure it out, he said firmly. But first, we need to know what we're up against. Do you know how to stop them? Lyra hesitated, then shook her head. I'm not sure. My power is tied to the land, but it's been dormant for so long. I need time to reconnect, to remember how to use it. Before John could respond, a loud bang echoed through the base, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the door. They both jumped to their feet, their hearts pounding. They're here, Lyra whispered, her eyes wide with fear. John grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. Outside, he could see shadowy figures approaching, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. They were larger than he had expected, their forms twisted and unnatural. Stay behind me, John said, his voice steady. We'll hold them off as long as we can. Lyra shook her head. No, John. This isn't your fight. I can't let you risk your life for me. John turned to her, his expression fierce. You're not alone anymore, Lyra. Whatever happens, we face it together. The door shook again, the sound of splintering wood filling the air. John raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. Lyra stood beside him, her hands glowing faintly as she summoned her power. The door burst open, and the Voidwalkers poured in, their growls filling the room. John fired, the sound of the rifle echoing through the base. The first creature fell, but more were right behind it. Lyra stepped forward, her hands outstretched. A wave of energy surged from her, knocking the creatures back. But it wasn't enough. They kept coming, their eyes fixed on her. "We need to go," John shouted, grabbing her arm. They ran through the base, the Voidwalkers close behind. John led Lyra to a back exit, his mind racing. They needed a plan, a way to escape and regroup. As they burst outside, Lyra suddenly stopped, her eyes widening. "John, look!" He turned and saw it, a faint glow in the distance, coming from the direction of the ancient ruins. It was the same blue light he had seen when he first found her. "What is that?" he asked, his voice tense. Lyra's eyes filled with hope. "It's the land, it's calling to me. If I can reach it, I might be able to stop them." John nodded, his grip tightening on her hand. "Then let's go." They ran toward the light, the Voidwalkers close behind. The snow crunched beneath their feet, the cold air biting at their skin. But John didn't care. All that mattered was getting Lyra to safety. As they reached the ruins, Lyra stopped and turned to face the creatures. Her hands glowed brighter, the energy around her growing stronger. She closed her eyes, her voice echoing through the night. "This ends now." A blinding light erupted from her, engulfing the Voidwalkers in a wave of energy. They let out ear-piercing screams as they were consumed, their forms dissolving into nothingness. When the light faded, the ruins were silent. The Voidwalkers were gone. John stared at Lyra, his heart pounding. What just happened?" Lyra sank to her knees, her energy spent. I don't know. I just, let go." John knelt beside her, his hands on her shoulders. "You did it, Lyra. You stopped them." She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "But at what cost? My power, it's fading. I don't know if I can do it again." John pulled her into a hug, his voice steady. "We'll figure it out. Together." As they sat there in the ruins, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, John knew one thing for certain: their journey was far from over. The ruins were silent, the only sound the soft crunch of snow underfoot as John helped Lyra to her feet. She was weak, her energy drained from the immense power she had unleashed. But there was no time to rest. The Voidwalkers were gone, but John couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice low but urgent. "If there are more of them out there, we can't stay here." Lyra nodded, leaning on him for support. "You're right. But where can we go? They'll find us no matter where we hide." John thought for a moment, his mind racing. The research base was no longer safe, and the frozen wilderness offered little protection. But there was one place he hadn't considered, a remote outpost used by explorers and scientists, far from here. It was a long shot, but it might buy them some time. "There's an outpost about 2 days from here," he said. "It's small, but it's well hidden. We can regroup there and figure out our next move." Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, John. I don't know what I'd do without you." He gave her a small smile, though his heart was heavy. "Let's just focus on getting there first." They set off, the snow-covered landscape stretching out before them. The journey was grueling, the cold biting at their skin and the terrain treacherous. But they pressed on, driven by the need to survive. As they walked, Lyra began to recover some of her strength. Her connection to the land seemed to be healing her, though it was clear her power was still fragile. She walked beside John, her eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting danger at any moment. "John," she said after a while, her voice hesitant. "There's something I need to tell you." He glanced at her, his expression curious. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "The Void Walkers, they're not just after me. They're after something else, something I carry." John frowned. "What do you mean?" Lyra reached into the folds of her clothing and pulled out a small, glowing crystal. It pulsed with a soft, blue light, the same light John had seen in the ruins. "This is the heart of the land," she said, her voice filled with reverence. "It's a fragment of the Earth's energy, a source of immense power. My people entrusted it to me before they were destroyed. The Void Walkers want it, and if they get it, they'll use it to drain the life from the world." John stared at the crystal, his mind reeling. "And you've been carrying this the whole time?" She nodded. "I didn't want to tell you before. I was afraid you'd see me as a burden, or worse, a target." John reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Lyra, you're not a burden. You're important. To me, and to this world. We'll protect the crystal together." Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. "Thank you, John. I don't know how to repay you." "You don't have to," he said simply. "Let's just keep moving." They continued their journey, the crystal safely tucked away. But as the hours passed, John couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The landscape was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of the wilderness absent. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. Then, as they crested a hill, they saw it, a massive, dark structure looming in the distance. It was unlike anything John had ever seen, its jagged edges cutting into the sky like a wound. "What is that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra's face paled. "It's a Voidwalker stronghold. They must have built it after my people were destroyed. If they've grown this powerful." She didn't finish the sentence, but John understood. If the Voidwalkers had a stronghold, they were more organized, and more dangerous, than they had realized. "We need to go around it," John said, his voice firm. "We can't risk being seen." Lyra nodded, but as they turned to leave, a loud, guttural roar echoed through the air. John spun around, his rifle at the ready, just as a massive creature emerged from the shadows. It was unlike the Voidwalkers they had faced before, larger, more twisted, with glowing red eyes and jagged claws that gleamed in the moonlight. It let out another roar, its gaze fixed on Lyra. "Run!" John shouted, firing his rifle at the creature. The bullet seemed to have little effect, the creature barely flinching as it charged toward them. Lyra grabbed John's arm, pulling him back. "We can't fight it," she cried. "We have to go." They ran, the creature close behind. Its roars shook the ground, and John could feel its hot breath on his neck. He fired again, this time aiming for its eyes. The creature stumbled, giving them a brief moment to gain some distance. As they ran, Lyra suddenly stopped, her eyes widening. "John, look!" He turned and saw a narrow crevice in the rocks, just wide enough for them to slip through. Without hesitation, they scrambled inside, the creature's massive claws scraping against the stone as it tried to follow. The crevice led to a small cave, hidden from view. They collapsed inside, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The creature roared again, but it was clear it couldn't reach them. John leaned against the wall, his heart pounding. That was too close. Lyra nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched the crystal. "They're getting stronger, John. And they know we're here." He looked at her, his expression grim. "Then we'll have to get stronger too. We'll find a way to stop them, no matter what it takes." Lyra met his gaze, her eyes filled with determination. Together. As they sat there in the darkness, the weight of their mission pressing down on them, John knew one thing for certain: the battle was far from over. The cave was cold and damp, the faint light from the entrance casting long shadows on the walls. John and Lyra sat in silence, their breaths slowly steadying after the narrow escape. The roars of the creature outside had faded, but the tension in the air was palpable. John leaned his head back against the rocky wall, closing his eyes for a moment. His body ached from the relentless running and fighting, but his mind was racing. They were up against something far bigger than he had ever imagined, and the weight of it all was starting to sink in. Lyra sat beside him, her hands clutching the glowing crystal. She stared at it, her expression a mix of awe and fear. "This crystal, it's more than just a source of power," she said softly, breaking the silence. "It's a piece of the land's soul. If the Voidwalkers get it, they'll use it to destroy everything." John opened his eyes and looked at her. "Then we'll make sure they never get it." She turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've done so much for me, John. I don't know how to thank you." He shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. We're in this together, remember?" Lyra smiled faintly, but her expression quickly turned serious. "There's something else I need to tell you. The crystal, it's not just a burden. It's also a key." "A key?" John asked, his brow furrowing. She nodded. "A key to a place called the Sanctuary. It's a hidden refuge, built by my people long ago. If we can reach it, we might find a way to stop the Voidwalkers for good." John sat up straighter, his interest piqued. "Where is this sanctuary?" "I'm not sure," Lyra admitted. "The memories are still fuzzy. But I know it's somewhere in the mountains, far from here. If we can find it, we might stand a chance." John thought for a moment, then nodded. "Then that's where we'll go. But first, we need to rest. You're still weak, and we've got a long journey ahead of us." Lyra hesitated, then placed a hand on his arm. "John, I need to tell you something else." Her voice was so quiet that John had to lean closer to hear her. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, her eyes filled with emotion. "When I was in the ice, I dreamed of someone like you. Someone who would come and save me, not just from the ice, but from the darkness. I didn't think it was possible, but now, here you are." John felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent most of his life alone, focused on his work and his survival. But now, sitting here with Lyra, he felt a connection he had never experienced before. "I don't know why I found you," he said quietly. "But I'm glad I did." Lyra's eyes filled with tears, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. "Thank you, John. For everything." They sat like that for a while, the silence between them comfortable and warm. For the first time in what felt like forever, John felt a sense of peace. But it didn't last long. A faint sound echoed through the cave, pulling them both back to reality. It was a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of claws scraping against stone. John tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. "They've found us." Lyra stood, her expression grim. "We need to go. Now." They moved quickly, slipping out of the cave and into the cold night air. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but the growls were growing louder, coming from multiple directions. "They're surrounding us," John muttered, his grip tightening on his rifle. "We need to find a way out of here." Lyra closed her eyes for a moment, her hands glowing faintly. Then she pointed to the east. "There's a path through the rocks. It's narrow, but it might lead us to safety." John nodded. "Lead the way." They ran, the growls closing in behind them. The path was treacherous, the rocks slick with ice, but they pressed on. John kept glancing over his shoulder, his rifle at the ready, but the creatures were hidden in the shadows, their glowing eyes the only sign of their presence. As they reached the end of the path, Lyra suddenly stopped, her eyes widening. "John, look." He turned and saw it, a massive chasm stretching out before them, the other side barely visible in the moonlight. A narrow, rickety bridge was the only way across. "We have to cross," Lyra said, her voice urgent. John hesitated, his stomach churning at the thought. But the growls were getting louder, and they had no other choice. "Go," he said, gesturing for her to lead the way. Lyra stepped onto the bridge, her movements careful but steady. John followed close behind, his heart pounding with every step. The bridge creaked and swayed under their weight, the chasm below a yawning abyss. They were halfway across when the first creature appeared on the other side, its glowing eyes fixed on them. It let out a roar, its claws digging into the ground as it prepared to charge. "Hurry!" John shouted, his voice barely audible over the wind. They ran, the bridge shaking violently. The creature lunged, its claws slashing through the air, but Lyra reached the other side just in time. She turned and held out her hand, her eyes filled with panic. "John, jump!" He didn't hesitate. With a final burst of speed, he leaped off the bridge just as the creature's claws tore through it. The bridge collapsed into the chasm, the creature's roar echoing as it fell. John landed hard on the ground, Lyra pulling him to safety. They lay there for a moment, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "We made it," Lyra whispered, her voice filled with relief. John looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah. We did." But as they stood and looked out at the horizon, John knew their journey was far from over. The sanctuary was still out there, and the Voidwalkers would stop at nothing to find them. Together, they would face whatever came next. The mountains loomed ahead, their jagged peaks cutting into the sky like ancient sentinels. John and Lyra stood at the edge of the chasm, the cold wind whipping around them. Behind them, the growls of the Voidwalkers had faded, but the sense of danger was still thick in the air. "The sanctuary is close," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "I can feel it." John nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Then let's keep moving. We don't have much time." They set off again, the terrain growing steeper and more treacherous with every step. The snow was deeper here, and the wind howled through the rocks, making it hard to hear anything else. But John's senses were on high alert. He knew the Voidwalkers were still out there, and they wouldn't give up easily. As they climbed, Lyra began to share more about the sanctuary. "It's not just a refuge," she said, her breath visible in the cold air. "It's a place of power, built by my people to protect the heart of the land. If we can reach it, we might be able to use the crystal to stop the Voidwalkers for good." John glanced at her, his expression grim. "And if we can't?" Lyra met his gaze, her eyes filled with determination. "Then we'll find another way. But we can't give up, John. Not now." He nodded, his respect for her growing with every step. Despite everything she had been through, she hadn't lost hope. And neither would he. They reached a narrow pass between two towering cliffs, the path barely wide enough for them to walk side by side. As they moved through it, John couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, his rifle at the ready, but the path behind them was empty. "Something's not right," he muttered. Lyra stopped, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the cliffs above them. "They're here." Before John could react, a loud roar echoed through the pass. He looked up just as a massive Voidwalker leaped from the rocks above, its claws extended and its glowing eyes fixed on Lyra. "Move!" John shouted, shoving her out of the way as the creature landed where she had been standing. He fired his rifle, the bullets hitting the creature but doing little to slow it down. It lunged at him, its claws slashing through the air. John dodged, but the creature was fast, too fast. Lyra stepped forward, her hands glowing with energy. "Get back!" She unleashed a wave of power, knocking the creature off its feet. But more Voidwalkers were already emerging from the shadows, their growls filling the air. We're surrounded, John said, his voice tense. Lyra's eyes darted around, her mind racing. Then she pointed to a narrow opening in the rocks. There. We can make a stand there. They ran for the opening, the Voidwalkers close behind. The space was small, with high walls that would force the creatures to come at them one at a time. John took up a position at the front, his rifle ready, while Lyra stood behind him, her hands glowing faintly. Get ready, John said, his voice steady. The first Voidwalker charged, its claws slashing through the air. John fired, the bullets hitting it square in the chest. It stumbled but kept coming, its growls growing louder. Lyra stepped forward, her hands outstretched. A burst of energy erupted from her, slamming into the creature and sending it flying. But more were right behind it, their glowing eyes filled with rage. John fired again and again, his arms aching from the recoil. The Voidwalkers kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Lyra, we need a plan, he shouted over the noise. She closed her eyes, her hands glowing brighter. I'm trying, but my power, it's not enough. John glanced at her, his heart pounding. Then we'll make it enough. Together. She nodded, her expression filled with determination. Hold them off. I need a moment. John didn't question her. He focused on the Voidwalkers, firing with precision and forcing them back. But he was running out of ammo, and the creatures were getting closer. Just as one of them lunged at him, Lyra let out a cry. A blinding light erupted from her, engulfing the Voidwalkers in a wave of energy. They let out ear-piercing screams as they were consumed, their forms dissolving into nothingness. When the light faded, the pass was silent. The Voidwalkers were gone. John turned to Lyra, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What did you do? She sank to her knees, her energy spent. I don't know. I just, let go. John knelt beside her, his hands on her shoulders. You did it, Lyra. You stopped them. She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. But at what cost? My power, it's fading. I don't know if I can do it again. John pulled her into a hug, his voice steady. We'll figure it out. Together. As they sat there in the silence, the first light of dawn breaking over the mountains, John knew one thing for certain, their journey was far from over. The mountains were eerily quiet after the battle, the only sound the soft crunch of snow underfoot as John helped Lyra to her feet. She was weak, her energy drained from the immense power she had unleashed. But there was no time to rest. The sanctuary was close, and they couldn't afford to stop now. We need to keep moving, John said, his voice low but urgent. If there are more Voidwalkers out there, we can't stay here. Lyra nodded, leaning on him for support. You're right. But I don't know how much farther I can go. John looked at her, his expression filled with concern. We'll take it one step at a time. Just focus on me, okay? She managed a faint smile. Okay. They set off again, the terrain growing steeper and more treacherous with every step. The snow was deeper here, and the wind howled through the rocks, making it hard to hear anything else. But John's senses were on high alert. He knew the Voidwalkers were still out there, and they wouldn't give up easily. As they climbed, Lyra began to share more about the sanctuary. It's not just a refuge, she said, her breath visible in the cold air. It's a place of power, built by my people to protect the heart of the land. If we can reach it, we might be able to use the crystal to stop the Voidwalkers for good. John glanced at her, his expression grim. And if we can't? Lyra met his gaze, her eyes filled with determination. Then we'll find another way. But we can't give up, John. Not now. He nodded, his respect for her growing with every step. Despite everything she had been through, she hadn't lost hope. And neither would he. They reached a narrow pass between two towering cliffs, the path barely wide enough for them to walk side by side. As they moved through it, John couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, his rifle at the ready, but the path behind them was empty. "Something's not right," he muttered. Lyra stopped, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the cliffs above them. "They're here." Before John could react, a loud roar echoed through the pass. He looked up just as a massive voidwalker leaped from the rocks above, its claws extended and its glowing eyes fixed on Lyra. "Move!" John shouted, shoving her out of the way as the creature landed where she had been standing. He fired his rifle, the bullets hitting the creature but doing little to slow it down. It lunged at him, its claws slashing through the air. John dodged, but the creature was fast, too fast. Lyra stepped forward, her hands glowing with energy. "Get back!" She unleashed a wave of power, knocking the creature off its feet. But more voidwalkers were already emerging from the shadows, their growls filling the air. "We're surrounded," John said, his voice tense. Lyra's eyes darted around, her mind racing. Then she pointed to a narrow opening in the rocks. "There. We can make a stand there." They ran for the opening, the voidwalkers close behind. The space was small, with high walls that would force the creatures to come at them one at a time. John took up a position at the front, his rifle ready, while Lyra stood behind him, her hands glowing faintly. "Get ready," John said, his voice steady. The first voidwalker charged, its claws slashing through the air. John fired, the bullets hitting it square in the chest. It stumbled but kept coming, its growls growing louder. Lyra stepped forward, her hands outstretched. A burst of energy erupted from her, slamming into the creature and sending it flying. But more were right behind it, their glowing eyes filled with rage. John fired again and again, his arms aching from the recoil. The voidwalkers kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. "Lyra, we need a plan," he shouted over the noise. She closed her eyes, her hands glowing brighter. "I'm trying, but my power, it's not enough." John glanced at her, his heart pounding. "Then we'll make it enough. Together." She nodded, her expression filled with determination. "Hold them off. I need a moment." John didn't question her. He focused on the voidwalkers, firing with precision and forcing them back. But he was running out of ammo, and the creatures were getting closer. Just as one of them lunged at him, Lyra let out a cry. A blinding light erupted from her, engulfing the voidwalkers in a wave of energy. They let out ear-piercing screams as they were consumed, their forms dissolving into nothingness. When the light faded, the pass was silent. The voidwalkers were gone. John turned to Lyra, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What did you do?" She sank to her knees, her energy spent. I don't know. I just, let go." John knelt beside her, his hands on her shoulders. "You did it, Lyra. You stopped them." She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "But at what cost? My power, it's fading. I don't know if I can do it again." John pulled her into a hug, his voice steady. "We'll figure it out. Together." As they sat there in the silence, the first light of dawn breaking over the mountains, John knew one thing for certain: their journey was far from over. The first rays of sunlight broke over the mountains, casting a golden glow across the snow-covered landscape. John and Lyra sat together in the quiet aftermath of the battle, the air still tingling with the remnants of her power. The voidwalkers were gone, but the cost had been high. Lyra's strength was fading, and the journey to the sanctuary still lay ahead. John helped Lyra to her feet, his arm around her shoulders for support. "We're close," he said, his voice steady. Just a little farther. Lyra nodded, though her steps were slow and unsteady. I can feel it, John. The sanctuary, it's calling to me. They pressed on, the path growing steeper and more treacherous. The snow was deeper here, and the wind howled through the rocks, but John's determination never wavered. He had come too far to give up now. As they climbed, Lyra began to share more about the sanctuary. It's not just a refuge, she said, her voice weak but filled with hope. It's a place of healing, built by my people to restore balance to the land. If we can reach it, I might be able to regain my strength. John glanced at her, his expression filled with concern. And the crystal? What happens to it? Lyra's hand instinctively went to the glowing crystal hidden beneath her clothing. The crystal is the key. It will unlock the sanctuary's power, but it must be used wisely. If it falls into the wrong hands. She didn't need to finish the sentence. John understood the stakes. The crystal was a source of immense power, and if the Voidwalkers ever got their hands on it, the consequences would be catastrophic. They reached the top of a ridge, and there it was, the sanctuary. It was a massive structure, carved into the side of the mountain, its ancient walls glowing faintly with the same blue light as the crystal. The sight took John's breath away. We made it, Lyra whispered, her voice filled with awe. John nodded, though his heart was heavy. The journey had been long and grueling, but they had finally reached their destination. Now, they had to face whatever came next. As they approached the sanctuary, the air grew warmer, the snow giving way to lush, green grass. It was as if they had stepped into another world, one untouched by the cold and darkness of the outside. Lyra's strength seemed to return as they drew closer, her steps becoming more confident. She led John to a massive door, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to pulse with energy. This is it, she said, her voice filled with reverence. The heart of the sanctuary. She placed her hand on the door, and the carvings began to glow. The door slowly opened, revealing a vast chamber filled with light. The air was warm and inviting, and John felt a sense of peace wash over him. They stepped inside, the chamber's walls lined with ancient symbols and glowing crystals. In the center of the room was a pedestal, its surface smooth and polished. Lyra approached the pedestal, her hands trembling as she removed the crystal from her clothing. She placed it on the pedestal, and the room was filled with a blinding light. John shielded his eyes, the light so intense it felt like it was piercing his soul. When it finally faded, he looked up to see Lyra standing before him, her eyes glowing with power. John, she said, her voice filled with gratitude. You've done so much for me. I don't know how to thank you. He shook his head. You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad we made it. Lyra smiled, her expression filled with warmth. The sanctuary's power is restored. The land will heal, and the Voidwalkers will never threaten us again. John felt a sense of relief wash over him, but it was short-lived. Lyra's expression turned serious, and she reached out to take his hand. There's something else, she said, her voice soft. The crystal, it has the power to grant one wish. A single act of great power, but it can only be used once. John frowned. What are you saying? Lyra's eyes filled with tears. I want to use it to give you something, John. You've sacrificed so much for me, for this world. You deserve to be rewarded. John shook his head. Lyra, I don't need a reward. I did what I had to do. But Lyra was insistent. Please, John. Let me do this for you. What do you wish for? John thought for a moment, his mind racing. He had spent so much of his life alone, focused on survival. But now, sitting here with Lyra, he realized what he truly wanted. I wish for you to live a free and happy life, he said finally, his voice filled with emotion. You've been through so much, Lyra. You deserve to be free. Lyra's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled him into a hug. Thank you, John. For everything. The crystal glowed brightly, its power surging through the room. When the light faded, John felt a sense of peace he had never known before. Lyra stepped back, her eyes filled with determination. The sanctuary is safe now, and so is the land. But there's still so much to do. Will you stay with me, John? Help me rebuild what was lost? John smiled, his heart filled with hope. I'm not going anywhere, Lyra. We're in this together. As they stood there in the heart of the sanctuary, the first rays of sunlight streaming through the ancient walls, John knew one thing for certain: their journey was far from over. But whatever came next, they would face it together.